From the late 1800s to the middle of the 1900s, a notable percentage of the country were quite pro-socialism, communism, or anarchism. They saw it as very American. Equality and freedom and democracy in the labor force, going back to the days before the robber barons, when there was equality in labor among free people. However, the moneyed elite did not, and government corruption was reaching a crescendo the U.S. had never seen before. But the purposes of the Boston Tea Party and Revolution had fought to overthrow was forgotten, and America was breaking at the seams. Robber barons essentially owned government officials with bribes or campaign contributions. Labor strikes and boycotts and any attempt to organize their labor and demand more rights led to violence from the state, such as the Pinkertons, getting used against labor strikers. Ireland had it even worse, as many labor leaders were treated as traitors and hanged, and are part of Irish song and lore. Many labor organizers in the U.S. were arrested and jailed, and radical communists and anarchists used terrorist tactics, which the government and press lumped unions into, giving them more public and political approval to bust up unions. Unions were not all influenced by Marx. There were ranges of people who joined, from capitalists to anarchists, but they stood firm together, and finally, after some terrible safety violations came to light, and treatment of people was known, such as the Triangle Shirt Factory fire, unions began to gain more and more power. As union membership increased, they began using many tactics that gained them more and more power. Calls for boycotts of their companies, calls for secondary boycotts of companies that sold their company's products, wildcat strikes, which were strikes not organized by union leaders, but just to show their bosses who was in charge. Solidarity strikes, where workers would strike in solidarity with a fellow company or industry until they got their demands, so their fellow bosses would put pressure on other businesses so they could start working again. If a company claimed they didn't have the money for raises, the union leader said, "Hey, we'll sit down with you, open up their books and see where costs and profits for shareholders could be cut and raises to the average person could be given." If the bosses were telling the truth about not having enough money, they would get back to work, as they were all in this together now. They got the 40-hour work week for us, safety requirements so there was less death and dismemberment, pensions and care for people who were hurt by their safety problems. However, their ultimate goal was to completely democratize the workplace, which the wealthy feared the most and hated. Unionizing was an international movement, with the International Workingmen's Association, also called the First International, was an international organization of socialists, trade unionists, communists, and anarchs, all with a goal of strengthening unions and getting workers' rights. This group lasted from 1864 to 1876, where there was a falling out between the Marxists and the anarchs, as the anarchs claimed Marx was an authoritarian, and a Marxist government would just be as oppressive as a capitalist one. The Second International excluded the anarchs, and continued until 1916, when World War I broke out and loyalties to nations overcame class solidarity. Post-war, the USSR tried to hold a Third International, but most of the unions realized that this new Bolshevism was not even remotely free or fair, and was only communist in name according to them, to get working people's support worldwide. The working man in the US was gaining more and more power. The country boy and redneck was gaining a living working wage. 1930s to 1940s saw an influx of union membership. FDR was their man. With 12 years of very corrupt, laissez-faire capitalism, the economy crashed worse than the world had ever seen, and unless you were a farmer, you were jobless. Farmers couldn't sell their crops thanks to gluts in the market, so they couldn't pay to hire more of their jobless factory workers. Many had no choice but to work in terrible conditions and become scabs to take union jobs while they were striking. FDR encouraged people to join unions and was able to pass many laws protecting unions and helping them keep their power. He signed into law the Wagner Act, a profound union rights bill preventing company coercion, allowing people to join unions, giving lots of power to union shops, and prevent discrimination against whistleblowers of safety violations. Unions were going into full swing, showing the power of the people. By the end of the 30s, the unions were powerful and strong, driven by the Depression, as well as socialist and communist sentiment, and thought they were on their way to allowing unions to do all the hiring and firing, and allow democracy in the workplace, or mutualism light, and ensuring every worker was protected by a union. Then World War II broke out and crushed their plans. To ensure war solidarity, the unions agreed to stop striking during the war. But that was to their detriment. Many went off to war and never came back, many lost their practice in striking and got rusty, but the rich capitalists had not stopped their fight to smear and fear unions and socialist thinking. As people began coming back from the war, the unions began getting back into the swing of things, and were fully set to democratize the workforce, but capitalists were years ahead of them now, and the Taft-Hartley Act was passed in an off-year election of 1947 that stripped unions the right to call for things like secondary boycotts, which hurt their powers, and made any money lost on a wildcat strike to have to come out of the pocket of a union leader. And thanks to Stalin and Mao, using the new Red Scare, forced all union leaders with communist or socialist ties to resign, which was about 20% of the union leaders. People who worked under these now blacklisted union leaders were reported to prefer them, as they were way more democratic and took better care of them. Many pro-capitalist bosses didn't like the communists because when voting in unions, communists would get together, decide what they wanted, and then they would go vote lockstep, similar to how modern Republican Party does voting. If they refused to sign an affidavit saying they weren't communists, the union would lose all protections the Wagner Act had provided. Communists were also removed by the government from union ballots. It's said that since then, unions cut off their own left foot and have been limping around in circles ever since. However, with the Soviet Union viewed and painted as a menace, for sadly really good reasons, all communists in America became distrusted, and even just socialism became an evil and dirty word. The wealthy had started their own very subtle PR campaign back in the advent of radio, often mixing racist sentiment into it, especially in the South. They began using and monopolizing radio, using certain unscrupulous trusted pastors to equate capitalism with Jesus and unions and communism with the devil, Billy Graham being one of the major later ones. They began creating a fear of big government, and sadly with the rise of the USSR and Stalin, they had a lot of fodder to work with. Capitalism was Jesus, freedom, and America. Communism was atheism, slavery, genocide, and Russia. As more countries embraced this violent, oppressive, strongman form of communism, it appeared to be a cancer taking over the world, and all communists, like the Japanese citizens during the war, became suspect of being traitors. Harry Truman was sadly a rather ignorant man about war and foreign policy, who was left completely out of the loop, and then was suddenly handed the presidency with the death of FDR, and a strong anti-communist got his ear. He in fact most likely dropped the A-bomb not to stop the war in Japan. The Soviet Union was already slated to take over Manchuria and cut off the Japanese supply line. We had already leveled their cities more than an A-bomb could with bomber raids. That A-bomb was most likely specifically used to show the Soviet Union we had it. The rules of war had changed as one bomb could replace hundreds of planes. The proxy war on unions via communism. Post-World War, with the House on Un-American Activities and Truman and Eisenhower afraid of communism, even with outspoken, prominent, loyal, Constitution-loving Americans, communists like Woody Guthrie, who's famous for "This land is my land," communists, socialists, and anarchists being hunted down and blacklisted and brought up on false charges, along with people who weren't even socialist in the slightest. In the end, thanks to Taft-Hartley, unions became a shell of their former selves, stopped spreading to other industries, and became a complaints department. And thanks to FDR, it was Germany, not the US, that got this mutualist light union system that has helped them strongly. Since unions couldn't hire and fire their own, they just made it really hard for anyone to get fired, which created the stereotype of the lazy union worker. In many cases, only the mob was able to make a union function, and of course some money skimmed off for the mob itself. This is where socialism and the left became taboo. Unions tried a strategy called Operation Dixie, where they tried to recruit more Southern unions, but abandoned their anti-racist stance, promising segregated unions in hope of gaining more white union members, but ended up losing all workers, black or white, with their tepid campaign, and were attacked for race baiting even though they never talked about race once, making the incredibly racist South reject them on a large scale. Many pro-business people ran the unions and colluded with them, or the mob essentially stepped in to take the place of socialist union leaders. They decided to focus on helping the companies expand in new markets and support capitalism so they wouldn't be viewed as communists. The AFL-CIO ended up replacing their yearly negotiations of contracts and strikes and the ability to help run the company, and much less in exchange to a 5-year labor contract for pension benefits, healthcare, large upfront wage raises, and grievance protections. The unions became much more of a bureaucratic grievance procedure, and much less about expanding the welfare state like they had before. They created their own little union-only welfare state, often isolated to white people, and 65% who couldn't get union benefits began to feel left out of the system, viewing them as spoiled, lazy, and entitled out of jealousy that they had none of the same benefits. This led to a decline in union membership over time. Many just know of Martin Luther King Jr. as a civil rights activist, but 50% of his life was spent preaching anti-war and helping people organize unions and strikes for better labor conditions. Because of this, he was smeared by the government, the FBI, and people against King as being a communist. While he did lean socialist and sympathize with Marx's ideas, he believed the merits of capitalism as well. White-collar jobs had always been higher paying than blue-collar jobs, and as companies needed skilled workers in the white-collar jobs, they always had to pay more than blue-collar jobs. Thanks to unions raising their own wages, that trickled up to the white-collar as well. Therefore, white-collar never bothered to unionize to their own detriment. In the 90s, Bill Clinton signed into law a Reagan initiative called North American Free Trade Agreement, which got all the blame for two other factors going on in the world at the time. One being China opening up cheap manufacturing, which lost the US 5 times the number of jobs that NAFTA did due to raw material logistics, cheap labor, and that the Chinese government invested in their people educationally. Automation killed even more jobs than NAFTA and China combined, and while NAFTA created more jobs than it killed overall, it still gets all the blame for the negative impacts on labor from globalization. And Bill Clinton squarely got the blame for NAFTA even though it was a Reagan idea, and would have benefited us all if education was free to all. Instead, it was an incredibly painful transition for all Americans. With primarily rapidly expanding automation, but also NAFTA and the expansion of globalization, would an expanded welfare state that the early focus of the unions would have actually made a boom with better safety nets and free education for all. Instead, it was just very hard on workers and crippled unions as blue-collar jobs shrank. Just as Marx predicted, all of the short-term benefits that the AFL-CIO had gained ended up being non-sustainable, and pensions collapsed and became null and void. And here we are now, a nation used as an example and a warning by unions and the rest of the industrialized world as to how unions can be systematically damaged and destroyed. The only way to repair unions is to repeal the Taft-Hartley Act, but there are so many other problems on the table, I don't see that happening for a long time. We also must end the two-party system with instant runoff or ranked choice voting, as we can never swing from radical labor to moderate. We can only ever swing from extreme left to extreme right. The left makes moderate gains, the right takes radical gains. The swing continues forever, and only in extreme poverty, such as the Great Depression, does labor get a large enough level of support. Good propaganda moves stereotypical rural working-class folk who, thanks to the Electoral College, has more voting power and representation than city voters, from a well-informed, wide-ranging capitalist skeptic individuals fighting against the moneyed interest to a good Christian Republican capitalist, or at least a radical fiscal libertarian, hard-working to the point of exhaustion, anti-intellectual who are losing good jobs and becoming unemployed left and right, thanks mostly to automation, but they blame the immigrants, Democrats, and globalization for all their problems. They believe the claim that unions kill jobs because they demand higher wages, but as the increased minimum wage study shows, when the middle class has more spending money, they spend way more of it than people at the top do, who hoard it, which creates more jobs. The majority of the American rural citizen, especially older ones, are victims of misinformation campaigns, utilizing implicit racism, sexism, natural geographic isolation, and fear of the government that makes living in rural regions even possible, as rural states get way more from the federal government than they put in, and that is fine because we in the city need food and other raw goods. But they who benefit from our hard-earned tax dollars, thanks to massive differences in cost of living, are the most likely to fear government and be most against paying taxes. Sadly, at this point in our nation, we became the victims of our own success, and don't see how important unions were until it's too late. Luckily for us, agriculture and many service industry jobs were exempt from the Wagner Act, and therefore also from Taft-Hartley Act, and therefore have the ability to use strikes and boycott tactics other dying unions can't. Fight for 15 is trying to unionize restaurants. We may also push for increased minimum wage tied to inflation and cost of living by county. 10 cents times cost of living times inflation by county is what we should be shooting for, as raising minimum wage in rural regions would wreck the economy there, driving business away, while $15 an hour is barely livable in some big cities. Low cost of living based wages would drive businesses to bring jobs back to small towns and raise their standard of living. And when they raised the standard of living, their wages would also rise to meet the demand, and the cost of living, with this law in place, more evenly dividing the wealth and jobs around the nation. Another idea is a guaranteed basic income, which needs to be tested on a large scale, or start at a low level, perhaps getting its funding from an automation tax recommended by Bill Gates, which would fix many of the problems Marx had with automation to begin with, as companies may slow a little on replacing their workers with machines, and if the cost of the machine was worth it, the former worker would still get the benefit of technology, which was only made possible by basic science spending of a state we all paid taxes into. A guaranteed basic income was something that Thomas Paine was a big proponent of. Data shows that unless you save 10 to 15% of your income for retirement now for your 401k because pensions are no longer available as unions are dying, you won't have enough for retirement. 401ks were never meant to be the sole form of retirement as they were impacted by the market forces, but we were sold it just as common sense good money management. While Social Security keeps getting stripped away and denigrated as a Ponzi scheme, which is one of the few things keeping some poorer areas afloat during recessions as they aren't subject to market shocks. Minimum wage has stagnated since the 1980s, while the CEOs make millions each year. In Japan, the wage disparity of a company between the lowest and highest paid worker is 10 to 50 times the lowest worker's pay. In the US, that's more like 1,500 times. And that is considered good free market capitalism, and instead of cutting top earners' pay or reducing dividends to their shareholders, they lay workers off in droves for short-term gain that if they had kept the people on and worked to retrain them, could have led to the company keeping up with the times. Instead, most companies don't innovate at all.